They laughed when she called me just a security guard, but they didn't know the house I'd built and the fear I could wield. That single sentence, flung across the living room like a dagger, lodged itself in my chest and refused to budge. It was a chilly December evening in Chicago, 2022, the wind rattling the windows of our Lincoln Park home, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a neighborhood dog. Inside, the living room glowed with the muted warmth of a flickering fireplace. Pine from the freshly trimmed Christmas tree mingled with the cinnamon scent drifting from the kitchen. Glasses clinked as laughter bubbled from the family gathering, yet all I could hear was her voice, sharp and dismissive, piercing through the festive cheer. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. She was leaning casually against the mantel near my son, tossing her words over her shoulder with that haughty smile. "Oh, please, Dad, you're just a security guard." My son's expression flickered, caught between pride in me and shock at her audacity. The room seemed to constrict around me. Each ornament, each reflection in the polished floor mocked me. After decades of invisible work, of late nights securing contracts and building the company from scratch, her words reduced me to a punchline. I moved toward the counter, where a crumpled $25,000 bonus check sat, proof of my years of dedication. My fingers traced the edges, underlining the date with careful precision, and I slipped it into the drawer that held every significant receipt, client contract, and signed confirmation. My silent ledger of victories. Each item testified that I was far from just a guard. Outside, snow crunched softly, a quiet rhythm against the street lamps, as if marking the passage of time while injustice sat at the center of my own home. The flickering fire cast shadows across the room, twisting and stretching like the resentment curling in my chest. I flashed back to 1995, alone in a cramped office, calling clients from payphones late at night, sleeping on a thin cot because I couldn't afford rent. I remembered clawing my way through every obstacle, often hungry and exhausted, driven by a single thought. One day the work would speak for itself. And now, in this moment, her arrogance reminded me that recognition could still be stolen from me, even in my own home. The laughter mingled with the crackle of the fire, and a shiver ran through me. Not from the cold, but from the awareness that my son's perception of me was vulnerable. I felt the first flicker of a plan forming. Every glance, every offhand remark, every subtle family interaction could become a piece in a strategic puzzle. I would respond, but not with anger or confrontation. My revenge would be deliberate, lawful, psychologically precise, a revelation that would leave no doubt who commanded respect and authority. I retreated to my office, the warmth of the fire fading into the analytical glow of the desk lamp. I opened the drawer and organized receipts, contracts, and bonus slips chronologically, each document a testament to the empire I had nurtured. My eyes lingered on a client confirmation from December 3rd, 2022, timely deposit, verified signature, all aligning perfectly. These were the breadcrumbs I would use, every detail meticulously accounted for. Even the faint hum of the heating system and the ticking of the antique clock seemed to synchronize with my thoughts. A subtle doubt crept in. What if my strategy fractured the family? Could my son become a casualty of this? I shook it off. Respect and dignity could not be bartered away. Every shadow on the wall, every whisper of wind through the window, every faint scratching of a pen on paper became part of a rhythm guiding my plan. Even minor misdirections, like a misplaced document I allowed her to notice briefly, would feed suspense later, a seed planted long before the harvest. I reflected on the first major contract I had won, a $32,000 security agreement I had secured against every doubt and competitor. The sleepless nights, the detailed negotiations, the client handshakes, all of it had built a foundation, one she now dismissed with a single careless phrase. But this insult would not linger unaddressed. It had lit a fire, channeling years of invisible effort into a precision plan for recognition, authority, and justice. The stage was set, the pieces were aligned, and unseen by any of them, the game had begun. The house was quiet, but not truly empty. The laughter and clinking glasses of the holiday gathering had faded hours ago, leaving only the faint hum of the heater, the distant traffic outside, and the irregular creak of floorboards beneath my steps. I sat alone in my office, the door closed against the world, and felt the hollow echo of her words linger. Just a security guard. That phrase repeated itself in my mind like a taunt I couldn't shake. I ran my fingers over the stack of contracts and receipts I had carefully organized the night before. Each sheet represented more than money. It was evidence of decades of diligence, of nights I had gone without sleep, of every negotiation, every client whose faith I had earned. I could almost hear the rustle of papers whispering back at me, a chorus of accountability and proof. But the hollow silence of the house outside made the room feel even heavier, as if the walls themselves were watching and waiting for the plan to unfold. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a moment, and the shadows in the corners of the office seemed to move subtly, stretching and curling. The dim light of the desk lamp flickered once, twice, as though testing my resolve. Faint vibrations from my phone made me jump. A client email, nothing urgent, but it reminded me that even in this isolation, the world outside continued to turn. Every message could be a risk, every misstep a clue that might prematurely reveal my intentions. I opened the email, a routine confirmation of a client's deposit. Nothing incriminating. Still, my mind ticked through contingencies, recalculating potential outcomes. I thought of my son. He was loyal, trusting, caught between his wife's arrogance and his father's silent fury. Could this plan, this subtle orchestration of respect and leverage, fracture the bond we had nurtured? I clenched my fists and reminded myself the plan would not harm him. Every move had to be measured, legal, unavoidable in its clarity. My son's loyalty was part of the ledger, a line as real and binding as any signed contract or bank slip. The first nights of planning were sleepless. I wandered through the house, taking note of every detail, the ticking of the antique clock in the hallway, the gentle drip of condensation from the kitchen sink, the way the wind rattled the bay window. Each small sound became a marker, a heartbeat in the rhythm of my calculations. Shadows shifted with the passing hours, sometimes aligning with the flicker of streetlight through the blinds, giving the impression of movement where none existed. I began to weave these cues into a subtle psychological pressure, almost imperceptible, enough to unsettle without revealing the purpose. I pulled out a faded contract from 2019, signed under fluorescent office lights and a tense handshake, and traced the details. The client had trusted me then, and the same trust now anchored my leverage. A minor setback arrived unexpectedly. A misfiled receipt, one of the $25 million client agreements accidentally placed in the wrong folder. My stomach knotted. If discovered prematurely, it could hint at my intentions, perhaps alerting my daughter-in-law to my awareness and strategic buildup. But I adjusted instantly, correcting the error and noting it in my internal ledger. Every small challenge became an opportunity to refine the plan, to ensure that when the moment arrived, it would be undeniable, precise, and unassailable. Faint whispers of doubt threaded through my mind, the echo of her laughter still audible, taunting. I imagined her pacing through the house, oblivious to the subtle shifts in documents, the contracts temporarily misplaced, the small shadows I allowed to linger in her peripheral vision. Every minor oversight was intentional now, a breadcrumb in the psychological web I was weaving. I recalled the first time I had negotiated a client away from a far larger competitor. Every glance, every misread cue, every small delay had been leveraged to perfect effect. The memory grounded me, reminding me that precision was power. Time stretched unevenly. Nights blurred into early mornings, and each sound, the creak of a floorboard, a distant car horn, the soft hum of the refrigerator, was catalogued in my mind. Haunted cues became part of the tapestry, a pen rolling off the desk at the exact moment she walked by, a faint notification ping when she was nearby, shadows thrown oddly across the wall. Each microtension built a subtle atmosphere of unease. I wasn't trying to frighten, I was establishing presence, letting her intuition register that I was more than invisible, more than the label she had assigned. By the third night, the hollow silence of the house became an ally. I mapped every routine, every minor distraction, every window of opportunity. I considered potential leaks, family members who might unwittingly reveal a fragment of the plan, clients whose communication could intersect with home life. but each risk was neutralized. Evidence would be revealed gradually, with natural precision, as if by fate rather than orchestration. I paused, letting the quiet wrap around me. Even as my heart hammered, I felt a rare calm settle over the office. This was no longer about anger, it was about authority, respect, and reclaiming dignity. The hollow silence was not emptiness. It was the stage for strategy, the blank canvas on which I would paint the eventual revelation. The plan was taking shape, layer by layer, shadow by shadow, receipt by receipt. The world outside could continue its indifference, but within these walls, power and leverage were quietly consolidating. And as the first snow of December 2022 pressed against the window, I whispered to myself, every shadow, every creak, every faint vibration, it all counts. And she will know one day that I am far more than she ever imagined. The hollow silence had never felt more alive. The morning after those sleepless nights, I arrived at the office with the first real spark of clarity. The wind howled outside Chicago's narrow streets, rattling window panes and frosting the edges of parked cars. Inside, my office smelled faintly of coffee, paper, and the lingering scent of pine from home. I had called in the CFO and my legal advisor, a discreet but loyal duo who understood both numbers and nuance. The plan was taking shape, the kind of plan that required patience, precision, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Every contract, every bank slip, every client confirmation became a potential piece of leverage, and I intended to use them all. We gathered around my polished oak table. I spread out contracts and invoices, some signed decades ago, some freshly executed in 2022, each highlighted in pencil with notes along the margins. The CFO nodded, eyes scanning the figures. Every client deposit confirmed? He asked. I slid him a folder with the most critical documents, the $25 million company accounts, major client agreements, and signed contracts that reinforced my ownership and authority. Every last one, I said. And we'll need to keep these staged for her to stumble across eventually. She must believe she's noticing them by chance. The legal advisor, a quiet woman with sharp gray eyes, tapped her fingers on the tabletop. You want psychological leverage as well as financial? I nodded. Subtle cues, unexplained minor events, shadows that hint at presence without revealing the full picture. Everything will be lawful, but it needs to unsettle her just enough. She smiled faintly, recognizing the controlled intensity in my voice. We began assembling a timeline. Misplaced keys, delayed emails, innocuous notifications on her phone when she was near. Client confirmations left casually in view. These became the threads of a delicate web. I deliberately included a red herring, a misfiled email from a minor client, just enough for her to misinterpret to heighten the suspense without ever compromising the plan. Perception is everything, I muttered, tracing the timeline with a pencil. Each date, each minor coincidence, each apparent mistake was a calculated step. I recalled the negotiation of a $3.2 million security contract in 2018, when a competing firm had tried to edge me out. The same principles applied: minor slips, staged coincidences, and the natural unfolding of evidence could shift perception dramatically. The past became a blueprint for the present. I looked at the signatures on the contracts before me, particularly those she had unwittingly signed during routine company approvals. The knowledge that she had already left her mark on documents I controlled was intoxicating, a psychological seed planted without her awareness. By midday, the subtle haunted elements were discussed and catalogued. A pen that moved slightly when she approached, a document shifted on her desk, faint notifications that coincided with her presence. All legal, all designed to create mild unease and heightened attention. My CFO jotted notes carefully, confirming that every client confirmation and deposit record was double verified. The legal advisor prepared a layered folder of contracts and signed affidavits, ready to introduce during the eventual revelation. Everything was mapped, from the placement of documents to the timing of minor noises in the house, blending financial leverage with psychological tension. We paused for lunch. Outside, snow continued to fall, softening the city's hard edges, a quiet contrast to the meticulous plotting within the office. I watched the flakes drift past the window, thinking about how I had built this company from a single small office in 1995. I remembered sitting at a desk much like this, negotiating contracts over crackling phone lines, with little more than determination and a stack of cold coffee cups. Those early nights taught me one thing: attention to detail could turn seemingly small actions into overwhelming authority. I needed every element of that principle now. In the afternoon, the first false lead was carefully planted. I sent an email to her, deliberately ambiguous, suggesting a minor error in contract dates, a subtle trap to make her second guess her perception. The message was signed casually, professional, devoid of any personal indication of intent. My legal advisor approved it, noting that the ambiguity would create curiosity without crossing ethical or legal boundaries. I watched her interactions over the next 2 hours. She noticed, she paused, she corrected a minor issue herself, unknowingly confirming her exposure to the very documents I controlled. The psychological web was taking hold. The CFO leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowed. "You're blending psychological cues with financial evidence," he said. "If executed properly, she won't even realize how obvious it will look in the end." I nodded, letting the weight of that realization sink in. It had to be subtle enough to let her misread her own observations, precise enough to leave no doubt once the final revelation unfolded. Every misfiled receipt, every staged notification, every minor shift of a document was a brushstroke in the masterpiece of exposure. As evening fell, I revisited the contracts one last time. The $25 million ledger stood at the center of the plan, undeniable proof of ownership and authority. Each client email confirmed the veracity of my control. Each signed receipt validated my strategic leverage. I imagined the moment she would finally comprehend the depth of my foresight, the weight of decades of diligence colliding with her casual dismissal. The suspense, the irony, the psychological pressure had all been meticulously layered. I allowed a faint smile, knowing that even this early phase carried weight. She would feel shadows, subtle discrepancies, the faint sense that something was always slightly off, yet remain entirely unaware of the orchestrator behind it. The plan was no longer a sketch in my mind. It was an active breathing strategy, blending finance, psychology, and subtle tension into a form she could never contest. Finally, I reviewed the internal ledger I kept beside the $25 million account files. Notes on document placement, dates of client communications, minor inconsistencies introduced deliberately, and red herrings for added suspense. Each note was cross-referenced, time-stamped, and verified. The psychological build was as precise as the financial one. I closed the folder, feeling a rare satisfaction knowing that every piece of the puzzle was falling into place. As I left the office, the snow falling softly on the street outside mirrored the quiet patience I needed. Every shadow, every slight movement, every faint vibration of my phone, and every document left by accident in her path would guide her perception. She would never see the full picture until the precise moment it was revealed. And when that moment came, the irony, the authority, and the undeniable evidence would converge in a crescendo that could not be ignored or misinterpreted. I walked home through the soft winter dusk, hands deep in my coat pockets, imagining the subtle unease growing with each passing day, each minor shadow, each staged coincidence. The blueprint was no longer theoretical, it was active, and I knew deep in my chest that nothing she did could undo the intricate architecture I had built around this truth. This was no longer just planning. It was a masterclass in measured authority and anticipation. And for the first time since that insult, I felt the thrill of complete control, the quiet satisfaction that the shadows I orchestrated would speak louder than words ever could. The house felt different that week, a subtle tension in the air that was impossible to ignore. Chicago's December wind pressed against the windows, rattling panes with a hollow insistence, while snow accumulated quietly on the sidewalks, softening the city's harsh edges. Inside, I moved through the rooms with the familiarity of someone who had watched every detail for years, every creak of the floorboard, every faint echo of a distant laugh, every shadow cast by the flickering lights was catalogued in my mind. The stage for the unfolding psychological chess game was set, and the players were unaware. I began leaving small, deliberate hints of the company's operations in her path. A file slightly ajar on my desk, invoices casually visible under a stack of papers, client emails on the screen just long enough for her to notice. They were minor, innocent-looking cues, yet carefully orchestrated. She passed by my office twice, eyes darting toward the documents, a subtle furrow in her brow betraying curiosity mixed with unease. I felt a thrill of control. Each glance, each hesitation was a thread I could weave into the larger tapestry of perception. The pen on my desk shifted as if by accident. I had nudged it slightly earlier, anticipating her approach. She paused, then picked it up, moving it back to its original spot. That small interaction, innocuous to anyone else, was a victory, a reinforcement that the shadows and cues were effective. Every movement in my office, every misfiled receipt, every staged forgotten email was calculated to plant seeds of uncertainty, while leaving the illusion that she was simply noticing small coincidences. I thought back to the first contract I ever secured, the $45,000 agreement with a regional corporation, negotiated alone after weeks of being dismissed by more experienced competitors. The same principle applied now: subtle influence, precise timing, and psychological layering could sway perception without overt confrontation. I recalled every minor challenge overcome, every client reassured, every document meticulously verified. These were the same skills I now employed in this more delicate personal arena. The faint tick of the antique clock in the hallway punctuated my thoughts. I made mental notes of the hours, the routines, the minor vulnerabilities in her observation patterns. The CFO had confirmed all client deposits, bank slips, and agreements were accurate and verifiable. The legal advisor had prepared copies of contracts and affidavits to be casually discovered if needed. Each element was ready to converge at the right moment. But now the focus was psychological: hints, shadows, whispers, subtle pressure without alerting her to the broader scheme. I placed a few client confirmations on a side table near the doorway she often walked past. I deliberately left one envelope partially open, the top revealing a signature she had made months earlier during routine approvals. Her eyes caught it immediately. She stopped mid-step, hesitating, her gaze flicking from the document to me, then back again. That pause, that internal calculation of what she was seeing, was exactly the effect I had intended. She would never admit it aloud, but her curiosity and unease was now anchored in verifiable evidence. At the same time, I introduced minor haunted cues. A faint phone vibration when she was near, a soft scratching sound from the vent that could be mistaken for footsteps, shadows shifting against the wall in dim light, all designed to create the impression of presence and observation without intrusion. These elements were subtle enough to avoid alarm, yet strong enough to reinforce the notion that she was under scrutiny, even unknowingly. The combination of financial evidence and psychological cues was slowly closing in on her awareness. Flashbacks crept in between the moments of planning. I remembered my first major client negotiation, sitting in a stark office with nothing but a contract, a pen, and my conviction. The client doubted my experience, my reliability. I had relied on precision, preparation, and timing to secure the deal. The lesson was identical now. Even the smallest gestures, when orchestrated properly, could convey power and authority far beyond what anyone expected. She almost discovered a key document that afternoon, a client confirmation left too close to the edge of my desk. I had noticed her approach and subtly moved a stack of papers to shield it. Her hand hovered for a second. Then she withdrew, distracted by another minor cue I had left. A pen rolled across the floor, catching her attention. That micro-tension, a near miss, reinforced the illusion that she was uncovering things by chance, increasing her internal anxiety without her realizing the true design behind it. By evening, the atmosphere was charged with almost imperceptible tension. Pine scent from the tree mingled with the faint aroma of coffee left on the counter. The wind rattled the windows with persistent insistence, and shadows shifted as lights flickered across the room. She moved through the spaces I had prepared, her gaze subtly drawn to the staged hints, her mind unknowingly cataloging evidence that would later confirm the truth. I watched her from the corner of my eye, noting her reactions with clinical precision. Every glance, every hesitation, Every subtle adjustment she made reinforced the effectiveness of my strategy. I returned to my desk and reviewed the internal ledger, the meticulous notes detailing document placement, client confirmations, timing of minor cues, and psychological triggers. The red herrings had been deployed successfully. She believed she was piecing together inconsistencies, not realizing they were intentional, controlled, and harmless. Until the revelation, the plan's architecture was intact, unbroken, and progressing exactly as intended. As night settled over Chicago, I allowed myself a quiet moment of satisfaction. Every whisper behind doors, every shadow, every slight misplacement of documents had served a purpose. The subtle pressure was building, psychological tension layered atop undeniable evidence. When the day of the reveal arrived, the culmination would be undeniable: financial authority, family respect, and personal dignity restored with precision. I leaned back, listening to the faint hum of the house, the soft creak of floorboards, the wind against the windows. Every element, the shadows, the whispers, the documents, the minor haunted cues, was now an active participant in the plan. The chessboard had been set, the pieces subtly moving into position, and the checkmate, though weeks away, was inevitable. I allowed myself one final reflection before leaving the office. Every glance, every hesitation, every whisper behind a door contributes to the truth, and she will understand it, in her own way, at the exact moment I choose. The next morning, Chicago's streets were coated with a thin glaze of ice, the wind cutting sharper than the day before, pressing cold against every window pane. Inside, the house seemed to breathe with anticipation. Every creak of the old floorboards, every faint groan of settling beams became a subtle punctuation to the plan I had been orchestrating for weeks. The contracts lay spread across my desk, organized meticulously by date, client, and strategic significance. Each one a thread in a tapestry of evidence and authority, each one a lever of subtle influence over her perception. I began with client confirmations. Emails, signed receipts, and deposit notifications were printed and placed strategically around the office and common areas. Some were intentionally visible on the counter, others slipped into folders that would catch her eye as she passed by. The CFO had confirmed all deposits, ensuring that each financial record was accurate and verifiable. Even a minor misplacement of one document was accounted for, a red herring meant to heighten the suspense without compromising the integrity of the plan. She would notice, pause, perhaps even question herself, but the full architecture remained invisible until the final revelation. As I moved through the house, the subtle haunted cues intensified. Shadows shifted with every passing minute, a pen rolled slightly when she entered a room. Faint vibrations from the phone echoed at unexpected moments. Each micro-event was orchestrated to create curiosity and mild unease. I recalled a negotiation from 2017, a $2.7 million security contract I had secured against a larger competitor. The lessons of attention to detail, timing, and perception were exactly what I needed now. Every small cue, every staged coincidence had the power to influence perception far beyond the scale of the event itself. Mid-morning brought the first test. She appeared in the hallway, glancing at a partially visible contract I had left atop a folder. Her eyes flicked to the signature she had made months earlier during routine approvals. She paused, her hand hesitating in the air, then withdrew. I allowed a faint smile. The microtension was working perfectly. She believed she was noticing things by chance, unaware of the full, deliberate orchestration behind her observations. Every creak of the floorboard, every faint shuffle of paper, every distant sound from the city outside reinforced the perception of subtle, almost inexplicable activity. I revisited the ledger beside my desk, cross-referencing documents, timestamps, and cues. The minor haunted elements, the pen roll, the shadows, the phone vibrations, were mapped precisely alongside client confirmations, signed contracts, and deposit slips. Each layer of psychological pressure was synchronized with tangible, verifiable evidence. If she paused to think too deeply, the red herrings provided plausible misinterpretations, ensuring that curiosity remained high while certainty remained out of reach. Around noon, she nearly discovered a key folder containing a $3.8 million client contract. I had anticipated her route and moved another set of papers in the exact moment she approached. Her gaze lingered on the documents she could see, unaware of the most important pieces hidden just beyond her line of sight. That moment of near discovery was crucial. It reinforced the tension without revealing the plan. She left the room, puzzled, a slight furrow in her brow. Every hesitation, every pause, every distracted glance contributed to the cumulative effect I was constructing. The afternoon was filled with small adjustments. I shifted client confirmations from the kitchen counter to the study desk, nudged folders slightly out of reach, and recalibrated the timing of phone notifications. Each minor tweak ensured the illusion of randomness while maintaining full control. The house became a stage for subtle cues, the faint ticking of the antique clock, the whisper of wind through the partially closed blinds, the soft hum of the heater. Together, these created a backdrop for the unfolding psychological influence, an environment that guided perception without revealing intent. I reflected on the early days of the company, sitting alone in a dimly lit office, negotiating contracts with nothing but determination and a stack of cold coffee cups. I had learned that perception and patience were as powerful as authority and proof. The same principle applied now. The difference was that this stage was my own home, and the audience included someone who had dismissed me so casually, someone who underestimated the scope of my achievements. The stakes were no longer just financial. They were personal, entwined with family respect and authority. By late afternoon, every contract, receipt, and client confirmation had been reviewed, verified, and strategically placed. The haunted cues were layered with precision, creating micro-tension throughout the house. Minor setbacks, like a misfiled receipt or an almost discovered document, had been leveraged to heighten curiosity and reinforce the perception of subtle omnipresence. I watched her from the corner of my eye as she moved through the rooms, noting her reactions with clinical attention, her internal questioning, the small adjustments in her pace, the hesitant glances, all were proof that the strategy was functioning exactly as intended. Finally, I allowed myself a brief pause. The house was quiet again, the wind outside fading into soft evening whispers, and the snow lay thick and undisturbed on the streets. I leaned back in my chair, hands folded, and reflected on the orchestration of the day. Every document, every shadow, every vibration, every minor misdirection had contributed to an invisible pressure, an accumulation of subtle influence that would converge at the precise moment of revelation. The micro-tensions, the haunted cues, and the financial leverage were aligned perfectly. As I closed my ledger for the night, I whispered to myself, every creak, every shuffle, every pause, it all leads to recognition, and she will see it, all of it, in the exact moment I choose. The thrill was quiet, controlled, and absolute. The contracts and creaking floors had done their work. The stage was prepared, the audience unwitting, and the checkmate remained inevitable. The week before Christmas, the atmosphere in the house changed subtly, almost imperceptibly, yet I felt it in every step I took. Chicago's winter wind rattled the windows with a relentless insistence, carrying a fine layer of frost along the sills. Inside, the house seemed quieter than usual, though the occasional hum of traffic and distant car horns reminded me of the world beyond. I moved deliberately through each room, observing the placement of contracts, receipts, and client confirmations. Each item was positioned to maximize exposure to her gaze without appearing forced. The psychological web was nearly complete, the stage set for a moment she would never forget. She had begun to notice discrepancies, subtle anomalies that hinted at hidden control. A contract left slightly ajar on my desk, a pen rolling faintly as if nudged by unseen hands, phone notifications timed to coincide with her presence. These cues were working exactly as intended. I watched her from a distance, noting her slowed steps, the way her eyes lingered on documents she thought she had missed before. Her curiosity had shifted into tension, small micropauses betraying her internal uncertainty. The thrill of seeing the plan unfold without her knowing was intoxicating. Each morning, I reviewed the client confirmations, bank slips, and contracts once more. The $25 million company ledger remained fully verified, every deposit and signature accounted for, ready to serve as undeniable evidence when the moment arrived. I deliberately allowed minor red herrings to persist, misfiled receipts, an ambiguous email from a minor client, small elements designed to reinforce her perception that she was piecing together something unknown. She was beginning to question her own observations, yet the most critical evidence remained concealed, perfectly staged. The faint scent of pine from the Christmas tree mingled with the aroma of coffee I brewed in the quiet hours, creating a deceptively comforting atmosphere. Yet under that calm, every micro-tension was calculated. Shadows shifted slightly as I moved through the rooms, and subtle noises, floorboards creaking, pens sliding, were timed to coincide with her presence. Each small cue reinforced the psychological layer of the plan. She would feel observed subtly without understanding how or why. I recalled an early memory. Back when I had negotiated my first major contract alone, I had spent nights analyzing client behavior, anticipating objections, and staging small interactions to maximize trust and authority. Those lessons were invaluable now. The principle remained identical. Perception could be guided without confrontation, influence exerted without overt pressure. Even her smallest hesitation, every pause to recheck a document, every micro-expression of uncertainty, became proof that the subtle cues were effective. Midday brought a test. I noticed her glance at a client confirmation I had placed casually near the study desk. Her eyes widened slightly, then narrowed as if double-checking her memory. That pause, that hesitation confirmed the plan was taking hold. She believed she had noticed an inconsistency by chance, yet each detail had been orchestrated for maximum effect. Even the faint creak of the floorboard as she shifted her weight added to the perception of presence and influence. Minor false leads were strategically employed throughout the day. A slightly misfiled receipt, a contract envelope subtly nudged toward her path, an email notification timed to appear when she was nearby, all designed to reinforce uncertainty and curiosity. These elements worked together seamlessly, blending verifiable evidence with psychological influence. I watched her carefully, noting the internal calculation occurring behind her polite exterior. She was unsettled, questioning, yet unaware of the full structure behind her growing unease. By evening, the house was fully staged. Every document, every micro-tension cue, every minor haunted element was aligned precisely with the internal ledger I maintained. The shadows shifted with the dimming light, the faint hum of the heater blended with distant traffic, and the ticking of the antique clock punctuated each moment. She moved through the spaces I had prepared, her perception guided carefully toward discovery, without ever revealing the orchestration behind it. Every glance, every hesitation, every moment of doubt was proof that the plan was functioning perfectly. I paused in the study, reviewing the placements once more. The subtle haunted cues, the misfiled documents, and the red herrings were all accounted for. Each element reinforced both psychological tension and verifiable evidence, ensuring that when the moment of revelation arrived, it would be both undeniable and inescapable. The anticipation in her reactions, the uncertainty in her movements, were tangible indicators that the subtle pressure had reached its peak. Finally, I allowed a quiet moment to settle over myself. The house was alive with unseen tension, every element of the plan carefully aligned. Snow fell steadily outside, a silent witness to the orchestration within. I leaned back in my chair, imagining the culmination, her realization of the $25 million company ownership, the contracts confirming her unintentional participation, the psychological clarity of the carefully staged cues. Everything was converging toward that inevitable evening when recognition, respect, and authority would finally be restored. As night descended over Lincoln Park, I whispered to myself, every subtle creak, every misplaced document, every shadow and vibration, they all build the truth. And when she sees it, there will be no question, no doubt. Only the realization that I am far more than she ever imagined. The eve of reckoning was here, and the stage was ready. Every micro-tension, every psychological nudge, and every layer of verifiable evidence would align perfectly when the moment arrived. The evening of Christmas finally arrived. crisp and clear with snow blanketing Chicago in a fragile layer of white. Lincoln Park was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic, crunching footsteps, and the occasional bark of a dog. Inside, the house glowed warmly, the fire crackling as shadows danced across the walls. The table was set meticulously, fine china, polished silverware, candles flickering just enough to cast a golden haze. Family chatter and laughter filled the room, but beneath the festive cheer, tension simmered, a tension only I truly understood. She arrived first at the dining room, my daughter-in-law, carrying her usual air of confidence. She glanced at me as she took her seat, eyes briefly flicking toward the documents I had subtly positioned around the room. I allowed a faint smile, aware of the psychological cues taking effect. The subtle shadows, the carefully placed contracts, the faint phone notifications. All elements had primed her perception, creating the sense of an undercurrent she could not fully identify. She paused momentarily, then straightened, perhaps sensing something but unable to articulate it. My son noticed her hesitation, his expression a mix of amusement and curiosity. I could see him glance at me, a quiet affirmation of loyalty and trust. The other guests, extended family, and a few close friends remained unaware of the undercurrents swirling beneath the holiday decorum. I poured wine into glasses, allowing the liquid to catch the candlelight, each movement deliberate, unhurried. The table seemed ordinary, yet every detail had been orchestrated, every element staged for maximum psychological impact. The first wave of subtle suspense began with an envelope I had placed on the buffet near her seat. It contained a client confirmation, one she had signed months earlier. She noticed it immediately. Her hand hovered briefly, eyes narrowing as if trying to reconcile memory with evidence. She attempted to glance casually at me, but I met her gaze evenly, the calm in my demeanor amplifying the unease she could not name. The tiny shifts, the shadows, the ambient flicker of candlelight, all reinforced the sense that she was uncovering something significant, yet remained uncertain. I served the first course, placing each plate with precision. Conversation flowed, but her attention was split between the food and the subtle cues I had woven into the room. A slightly misfiled receipt poked out from under a decorative folder on the sideboard. A contract lay just long enough in her peripheral vision before I adjusted it under the guise of tidying. She glanced at each, hesitated, then forced a smile at the conversation around her. The suspense built invisibly, a tension unspoken but palpable. Midway through the meal, I orchestrated the second layer. I casually mentioned a few recent client developments, referencing large deposits and newly signed contracts, speaking in a tone of mundane business discussion. She perked up at the details, subconsciously cross-referencing with the documents she had glimpsed. The CFO subtly passed a folder across the table, visible only to her line of sight, containing verifiable evidence of the $25 million company ownership. Her eyes widened imperceptibly, and I noted the micro-expression with satisfaction. She was beginning to comprehend, though still not fully, the depth of oversight and authority I commanded. The third layer arrived with the dessert course. I allowed a gentle clatter of cutlery as I moved a few documents closer to her view. She picked up a contract, her hand trembling slightly as the candlelight reflected off the signature she had affixed months earlier. Recognition flashed across her features, mingled with confusion and a fleeting realization of the scale she had underestimated. Murmurs rippled quietly among the guests, subtle but perceptible. Some glanced at the documents, others at me, sensing a gravity that had been absent mere moments before. The cumulative psychological pressure reached its peak when I placed a final set of client confirmations on the table in plain view. The contracts, bank slips, and signed agreements formed an unmistakable pattern. She recognized her own signatures, juxtaposed against verifiable evidence of my control over the company. Her composure faltered, a brief hitch in breath and posture revealing the impact of perception colliding with reality. I allowed the moment to stretch, giving her time to process the convergence of financial authority and subtle cues she had unwittingly followed for weeks. A faint shiver ran through the room. Candles flickered as if on cue, shadows deepened across the table. The minor haunted cues. The soft vibration of a phone, The shifting pen, the almost imperceptible creak of the floor, reinforced the perception of deliberate orchestration. She glanced at me again, searching for a hint, a clue, a flaw. There was none. Every element, every document, every subtle tension was perfectly aligned. She understood, now, the magnitude of the empire she had so casually dismissed. Guests began to murmur more audibly, curiosity piqued by the documents and the subtle reactions she displayed. I allowed my son to lean slightly forward, acknowledging my authority without a word. The weight of decades of diligence, of strategic orchestration, and of psychological layering pressed into the room, unspoken yet undeniable. Every element, the shadows, the contracts, the receipts, the red herrings, had guided her to this precise moment. The revelation was absolute. She attempted to regain composure, arranging her posture, clearing her throat, offering a polite, if strained, smile. Yet each gesture only reinforced my authority. The irony was exquisite. Her efforts to maintain social dominance were neutralized by her own exposure to the evidence I had so meticulously staged. Every movement, every glance, every hesitation had been anticipated, accounted for, and leveraged. By the end of dinner, the cumulative effect was complete. She understood fully and irrevocably that I was far more than the security guard she had dismissed. Respect, authority, and recognition had been restored, legally, ethically, and psychologically. The room hummed with quiet tension, the final layer of suspense resolved. Yet the aftershocks lingered in micro-expressions, hushed whispers, and the subtle ambient creaks of the house. I leaned back slightly, observing the aftermath in real time. My son's pride was unmistakable. His loyalty reinforced. She, my daughter-in-law, absorbed the revelation, a mixture of shock, humility, and reluctant acknowledgement written across her features. Guests, oblivious to the full orchestration but aware of the gravity, watched and whispered. Every detail, every micro-tension, every staged cue had converged into a flawless cinematic climax. As the last candle flickered and snow fell softly outside, I reflected quietly to myself, decades of diligence, orchestrated subtly, culminate not in chaos but in undeniable authority. Every shadow, every creak, every document leads to recognition, respect, and justice. She will never forget this evening. The eve of reckoning had arrived and concluded. The perfect alignment of strategy, evidence, and psychological mastery. The aftermath of Christmas dinner settled over the house like a heavy, almost tangible fog. The fire in the living room had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls, and the snow outside had softened into a quiet, almost reverent hush over the streets of Lincoln Park. Inside, the air was thick with residual tension, the echoes of revelation, subtle and undeniable, still vibrating in every corner. My daughter-in-law sat stiffly, her composure returning slowly, but each micro-expression betrayed the storm that had passed through her. She now understood the scale of the authority she had so casually dismissed. I observed quietly from the corner of the room, letting the aftershocks unfold organically. My son's pride was palpable. He kept glancing toward me, a faint smile playing on his lips, silently affirming the restoration of respect and recognition. Guests murmured softly, some exchanging glances as they pieced together fragments of what they had witnessed, though none could fully grasp the intricate orchestration behind it. Every detail, from the placement of contracts to the subtle haunted cues, had reinforced the impact of the revelation. The first ripple appeared when she reached for her wineglass. Her hand trembled slightly, almost imperceptibly, betraying the internal calculation of events. I noted the moment carefully, logging it in my mind as part of the psychological ledger I had been maintaining throughout the plan. The contracts, receipts, and client confirmations remained subtly displayed, now fully recognized as instruments of authority rather than mere paperwork. Each tangible piece of evidence solidified the intangible realization she had just experienced. Shadows shifted across the room as the fire flickered and dipped, reflecting the weight of unspoken acknowledgement. I allowed her moments of pause, every hesitation magnifying the awareness of what had transpired. The faint hum of the heater, The occasional creak of the floor, the soft whisper of the wind through the blinds, these ambient cues subtly amplified the residual tension. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway, ticking steadily, punctuated the silence in a way that reinforced the gravity of the moment. A minor yet deliberate haunted cue unfolded when a pen slid off the table near her, as if nudged by unseen hands. She glanced down, startled, her eyes widening for a fraction of a second before quickly regaining composure. That tiny incident, though insignificant to anyone else, reinforced the sense that something extraordinary had occurred. The combination of tangible evidence and subtle psychological nudges left her unsettled, unsure where perception ended and reality began. I watched her carefully, noting how the tension lingered in her posture. Each movement, each micro-expression, reflected the residual impact of the revelation. The subtle misalignments, the contracts she had glimpsed, the bank slips casually displayed, these had achieved more than documentation could ever provide. They had rewritten her understanding of authority within the family, shifting the balance of respect and recognition irrevocably. Guests continued to murmur, some noticing the change in energy, others absorbed in polite conversation. I allowed these interactions to flow naturally, knowing that the aftershocks were subtle yet pervasive. Even the smallest gestures, her brief glances at documents, the slight stiffening in her shoulders, the pause before replying to casual questions, reinforced the psychological architecture I had constructed. Each moment was a verification, a quiet affirmation that the plan had succeeded beyond expectations. I reflected briefly on the orchestration that had led to this evening. Months of meticulous planning, layered evidence, staged coincidences, and psychological cues had culminated in this seamless revelation. The red herrings, minor misdirections, and subtle haunted cues had ensured she never fully grasped the design until the exact moment intended. Every contract, receipt, and client confirmation had played its part, as had the carefully curated ambient tension. The convergence of tangible proof and psychological pressure had been absolute. As evening deepened, I allowed a small sigh of satisfaction. The aftershocks were fading slowly, leaving a lingering sense of unease tempered by recognition of authority. The daughter-in-law's posture relaxed marginally, though every glance at documents and subtle shadows reminded her of the undeniable reality she had confronted. My son remained quietly proud, his gaze confirming the restoration of respect and recognition. The guests, unaware of the full orchestration, could feel only the residual tension and the quiet dignity radiating from me. Finally, I reviewed the subtle cues once more, mentally ticking off the evidence. Every contract, every receipt, every strategically placed client confirmation. The haunted cues had served their purpose, creating just enough uncertainty to heighten awareness without creating alarm. Red herrings had been deployed successfully, allowing her to misinterpret minor details, while the full scope of evidence remained concealed. Each element had contributed to the aftershock of psychological impact, leaving the room charged with residual acknowledgement and quiet authority. The house fell into near silence as the evening waned. Snow continued to drift softly outside, muffling the world beyond, creating a quiet cocoon for the final moments of observation. I allowed myself a private reflection. The plan had worked flawlessly. The micro-tensions, subtle haunted cues, and strategic placement of verifiable evidence had converged into a psychological and moral victory. Respect had been restored, recognition achieved, and authority unmistakably reasserted. I lingered in the corner of the living room, observing the subtle movements and expressions, allowing the aftershocks to persist just long enough to reinforce the permanence of the impact. Every glance she cast toward documents, every hesitant step, every pause in conversation, all served as confirmation that the strategy had succeeded. The culmination of months of planning and orchestration was evident in the quiet acknowledgement radiating from her posture and the composed pride reflected in my son's demeanor. As the night deepened, I whispered quietly to myself, a private aphorism to mark the moment. Authority is rarely claimed, it is revealed piece by piece in the quiet acknowledgement of those who once doubted you. The shadows and aftershocks had done their work, leaving the balance restored, dignity preserved, and psychological clarity firmly established. The eve of reckoning had been followed by the subtle yet undeniable echo of recognition, leaving an indelible mark that no casual dismissal could ever erase. The days following the Christmas revelation were quiet but charged with a subtle shift in the household. Chicago's winter had deepened, snow now thicker on the streets, muffling the sounds of traffic and neighborhood chatter. Inside, the house felt different. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind against the windows, and every shadow cast by flickering lights reminded me that authority and respect, once dismissed, had been reasserted. The subtle tension I had orchestrated during the holiday dinner now lingered, but in a measured, stabilizing way. I began by formalizing my presence in the company and household in small, deliberate ways. Client confirmations and contracts were reviewed daily, cross-referenced against the ledger I had maintained for months. Each document reinforced not just financial authority but also the perception of diligence and command. My son observed these routines with quiet approval, while my daughter-in-law navigated the household with a newfound awareness. Each glance toward documents and contracts a tacit acknowledgement of my role. One morning, I placed a set of client deposit confirmations on the study desk. She noticed immediately, pausing mid-step as her eyes scanned the verifiable evidence of my control over the $25 million company. Her hesitation, subtle yet unmistakable, confirmed that the restoration of respect had become internalized. She no longer viewed me as merely a security guard. Every document, every contract, every bank slip I handled was now a silent affirmation of authority, each placed strategically to maintain clarity without confrontation. The psychological balance was reinforced through continued subtle cues, slightly shifted papers, minor phone notifications, and the ambient hum of the heater all reminded her of the precision and oversight that guided the household and the business. These elements were not intended to unsettle, but to stabilize perception, her acknowledgement of authority without verbal confirmation. Even casual interactions, small gestures, and routine conversations were now weighted with the evidence of accountability and respect she could not ignore. I reviewed the ledger one final time, meticulously checking contracts, receipts, and client confirmations. Each item was in place, each date verified, and each signature confirmed. The red herrings and minor misdirections had served their purpose. Her perception had been guided subtly, allowing recognition to develop organically. Every small, deliberate cue, every faint shadow, every micro-tension that had been deployed over weeks now contributed to a reinforced, undeniable understanding of my role and authority. My son joined me in the office that afternoon, a quiet nod acknowledging the permanence of the restoration. His loyalty and respect had been affirmed during the holiday dinner, and now, observing the seamless orchestration of evidence and cues, he understood fully the strategic depth of my planning. Together, we reviewed the client confirmations, ensuring all deposits were accurate and all contracts valid. The process was methodical, reinforcing a sense of stability and authority that extended beyond the holiday revelation. My daughter-in-law's movements grew more cautious yet measured. She began to approach documents with deliberate care, noting details she might have overlooked before. Even small interactions, retrieving a file, observing a contract, cross-checking a receipt, were now layered with the recognition of the authority I held. It was a subtle psychological shift, a quiet acknowledgement that my diligence and oversight could not be dismissed. The balance within the household, once precarious, was now firmly restored. I allowed myself a rare moment of reflection, sitting back in the office chair as shadows shifted with the fading daylight. The strategy had succeeded. Respect and recognition were no longer aspirational. They were established, verified, and understood. Every document, every cue, every subtle haunted element had converged to create a permanent psychological and social equilibrium. The household now operated within a framework that reinforced authority without confrontation, subtly yet unequivocally. The next few days were spent maintaining this equilibrium. I continued to place client confirmations and contracts in visible yet strategic locations, reinforcing authority while allowing her to navigate her role with cautious awareness. Minor haunted cues persisted, soft and unobtrusive. A pen nudged slightly, the subtle creak of floorboards, faint vibrations from a phone at calculated intervals. These elements were no longer tools of suspense but instruments of psychological reinforcement, ensuring the restoration of balance remained intact. By the end of the week, the $25 million company ledger was fully acknowledged as mine, not just in documents but in perception. She no longer questioned my authority, and my son's loyalty remained unwavering. The subtle, haunted cues, psychological pressures, and layered evidence had achieved their purpose. Respect was no longer conditional, recognition had become permanent. The balance, painstakingly constructed over weeks, was complete. I allowed myself a quiet smile, reflecting on the process. The plan had worked flawlessly. The interplay of tangible evidence, psychological cues, red herrings, and subtle haunted elements had converged to restore authority and dignity. Every detail, every microtension, and every strategic placement of contracts and confirmations had contributed to a comprehensive, irreversible equilibrium. The aftermath was orderly, controlled, and psychologically satisfying. Finally, I whispered to myself, a personal aphorism to mark the conclusion of this stage. Authority is recognized not through force but through the subtle, undeniable accumulation of proof, diligence, and patience. Balance had been restored. Dignity had been reclaimed. The household and the company now reflected the respect, recognition, and authority I had meticulously cultivated. The house was quiet now, the aftermath of weeks of subtle orchestration settling like snow over the city streets. Chicago's winter had pressed the city into a hushed stillness, the wind rattling windows with a soft insistence, and the faint crunch of footsteps on ice outside creating a rhythm that matched the calm in my chest. Inside, every creak of floorboards, every flicker of shadow, every subtle movement of paper reminded me that respect and authority, once dismissed, had been reclaimed in their entirety. I walked slowly through the living room, observing the placement of contracts, receipts, and client confirmations. They remained exactly where I had left them, each one a tangible testament to the meticulous orchestration that had unfolded over weeks. The subtle haunted cues, the minor red herrings, the carefully staged psychological pressures, all had converged perfectly to restore balance and command. My daughter-in-law moved quietly, her awareness heightened but measured, acknowledging the authority I now fully embodied. My son's quiet pride, a smile lingering on his lips, reflected the permanent restoration of trust and respect within our family. I paused by the study desk, tracing the edges of client confirmations and contracts with my fingers. Every signature, every verified deposit, every documented agreement served as an anchor of authority. The $25 million company ledger, once casually dismissed, was now recognized in every interaction, every glance, every subtle acknowledgement of oversight. Authority was no longer aspirational, it was undeniable. Even small cues, the faint vibration of a phone, the shift of a pen, the subtle creak of floorboards reinforced this equilibrium without overt display. I reflected on the journey to this point. From the insult delivered on that December evening to the careful weeks of planning, each moment had been a thread in an intricate tapestry. Every microtension, every staged haunted cue, every minor misplacement of documents had been deliberate. The psychological orchestration had guided perception without confrontation, allowing recognition to develop organically. The evidence had been visible yet subtle, tangible yet understated, ensuring that when the culmination arrived, it was both undeniable and ethically sound. A quiet smile crossed my face as I recalled the initial insult, the dismissive words flung across the living room. Just a security guard. The memory no longer carried sting, only clarity. That moment had ignited the deliberate orchestration that led to this restoration of authority. Respect, once taken for granted, had been reclaimed. Dignity, once threatened, now stood unassailable. The culmination of financial leverage, psychological influence, and meticulous planning had achieved its purpose without cruelty, without force, only precision, patience, and lawfulness. I walked toward the window, looking out over the snow-covered streets of Lincoln Park. The city remained quiet, unaware of the orchestration within these walls. The glow of street lamps reflected against the snow, faintly illuminating the steady accumulation of frost on windowsills. The outside world seemed almost symbolic, calm, stable, indifferent, yet perfectly aligned with the internal equilibrium I had restored. Authority had been verified not through confrontation, but through the deliberate accumulation of proof and perceptual influence. Inside, the household moved with measured acknowledgement. My daughter-in-law, once confident in her dismissal, now navigated the environment with careful respect, her gaze lingering momentarily on contracts and receipts she had previously overlooked. My son observed with pride, fully aware of the layers of evidence, strategy, and psychological orchestration that had restored balance. The subtle haunted cues, the pen shifts, shadows, slight creaks, and carefully timed phone notifications continued to reinforce awareness, ensuring that respect was internalized and enduring. I reviewed the internal ledger one final time, tracing each document, each client confirmation, each bank slip, and every staged minor cue. The red herrings had served their purpose, ensuring that her perception of discovery remained guided, never premature. Every element, the psychological layering, the financial verification, the subtle haunted cues, was in place, creating an indelible framework of authority. Respect was no longer conditional, recognition was no longer negotiable, and balance had been firmly restored. The quiet of the evening allowed reflection. I realized that betrayal, carefully observed and meticulously countered, could be transformed into validation, authority, and recognition. The initial insult had triggered a deliberate process, but the outcome had been moral, lawful, and psychologically precise. Every step had been calculated to preserve dignity while restoring balance. The subtle tension, the layered evidence, and the careful orchestration had achieved a permanent equilibrium, leaving no room for doubt or misinterpretation. Finally, I allowed myself a private moment of closure. Leaning back, I whispered to the empty room, an aphorism to mark the conclusion of this journey. You didn't lose me, you gave me away. Authority, respect, and dignity had been reclaimed. The orchestration, meticulous and precise, had worked beyond expectation. Every shadow, every subtle cue, every micro-tension had contributed to a psychological and tangible victory. The household, the company, and the family structure had been restored to an ethical balance where recognition and respect were both undeniable and enduring. I paused and addressed the listener, softly, with the confessional tone that had guided every step of this story. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. The reminder felt natural here, interwoven with reflection, leaving the story both personal and immersive. The silence of the house was profound now, punctuated only by the faint ticking of the antique clock and the whisper of wind against the windows. I knew that every step, every document, every subtle haunted cue, every red herring, every psychological nudge had culminated in a permanent restoration of balance. The insult, once sharp and humiliating, had been transformed into a testament of authority, patience, and strategic precision. In this quiet, I could finally rest, observing the permanence of respect and recognition in every glance, every gesture, and every subtle acknowledgement from those around me. The days following the holiday revelation settled into a rhythm both predictable and charged with quiet acknowledgement. Chicago's streets remained coated in snow, muffling footsteps and traffic alike, while inside the house, every creak of floorboards, every flicker of candlelight, and every subtle movement of paper reminded me that authority, once challenged, had been permanently reasserted. The household now moved within an invisible framework I had orchestrated, each interaction colored by the lessons learned during those weeks of careful planning. My daughter-in-law navigated the space differently now. Each glance at contracts, receipts, and client confirmations carried the weight of awareness. She had begun to anticipate their presence, acknowledging authority in small, subtle ways, adjusting a stack of papers with hesitation, pausing before opening a document, scanning signatures she had once overlooked. The shift was quiet but unmistakable. The balance within the family had been recalibrated, her recognition of my role no longer tentative but internalized. My son's loyalty remained unwavering, reinforced by his first-hand observation of both the orchestration and the outcome. He moved confidently through his responsibilities, supporting the equilibrium that had been restored. Even casual family interactions reflected a subtle, unspoken acknowledgement of authority. His conversations with her carried a new cadence, an undercurrent of understanding that I was no longer merely a security guard, but the orchestrator of both household and company balance. I continued to maintain subtle cues and reminders, documents left casually visible, minor haunted elements like shifting pens or faint vibrations of phones, but now their purpose had shifted. They no longer unsettled, they reinforced permanence. The psychological architecture I had created ensured that respect was constant, recognition unquestionable. Every small gesture, every glance, every micro interaction became a quiet testament to authority reclaimed and balance restored. I allowed myself moments of reflection, walking through the quiet rooms, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the tempered glances, the acknowledgement of presence without words. The orchestration had transcended mere strategy. It had become a permanent framework for respect and recognition. The household operated now with a calm equilibrium, reinforced by subtle cues, tangible evidence, and the lasting impact of weeks of deliberate planning. As evening fell, and the snow continued to drift softly outside, I whispered to myself, observing the quiet dominance established without confrontation. Authority is most permanent when it is acknowledged, not challenged. Recognition is most lasting when it grows from subtle understanding. The aftermath had solidified my son loyal, my daughter-in-law cautious but aware, and every interaction a reminder that respect and authority had been reclaimed flawlessly, permanently, and without need for repetition. Weeks had passed since the Christmas revelation, yet the quiet satisfaction lingered like the last embers of a fire. Chicago's winter had softened, the snow now a steady white blanket across streets and rooftops, while inside the house life had resumed a calm rhythm. Every subtle cue, every micro-tension, every piece of evidence I had orchestrated continued to shape perception and behavior. Authority, once challenged, had not only been restored, it had become normalized, ingrained in daily interactions without a single overt assertion. The final irony revealed itself in the most unexpected moments. Loyal clients who had once only dealt with intermediaries casually remarked to me during routine calls and visits that they never realized I personally oversaw all contracts, approvals, and client negotiations. Their admiration was sincere, tinged with surprise, yet the best part was the unspoken acknowledgement of the control I had exercised quietly and consistently. They had always assumed these details were handled by someone else, never suspecting that I was the silent architect of every decision, every verification, every deposit. At home, the daughter-in-law moved with a measured awareness that was almost automatic now. She adjusted stacks of documents with care, checked client confirmations before casually leaving them visible, and approached interactions with a cautious respect she had never demonstrated before. She had internalized the authority she once ignored. My son continued to observe, pride evident in subtle gestures, reinforcing the permanence of balance within the family. Each glance, each measured action, each acknowledgement, though unspoken, spoke volumes. Even the minor haunted cues, once used to create suspense and uncertainty, now functioned as gentle reminders. Pens rolling faintly, shadows shifting subtly, faint vibrations from phones timed with presence. These elements were no longer manipulative. They were quiet affirmations of a system that worked, respect acknowledged, recognition enforced, and authority normalized. The house itself seemed to breathe differently, quieter, steadier, more aligned with the subtle power I had restored. In the solitude of my office, I reflected on the orchestration. Every contract, every receipt, every subtle cue, every red herring, every psychological layer had contributed to an outcome that was flawless in both ethical and practical terms. Authority had been reclaimed, balance restored, dignity reaffirmed. The irony, perhaps, was that the most loyal clients and family members had never known the extent of my personal involvement, yet their lives were subtly influenced by the control I exercised behind the scenes. I whispered to myself one final time, the aphorism of the journey settling like a quiet conclusion. True power is revealed not in recognition, but in the subtle, unperceived mastery over outcomes. The world may never know, yet the balance is absolute. That was the final irony. Complete authority, quietly executed, acknowledged only where it mattered, permanent and unchallenged.